Gaza, August 24, 2003. The late afternoon heat still weighs heavily on the streets of Rimmel when a white sedan slowly moves along the main road. It's just another ordinary day in that part of the Gaza Strip until the unmistakable sound of helicopter rotors shatters the silence. Within seconds, 3 Hellfire missiles transform the vehicle into an explosion that echoes throughout the neighborhood. Inside that car was Ismail Abu Shab, one of the founders of Hamas and paradoxically one of the few men who believed a real truce between Palestinians and Israelis was possible. The attack was carried out by an AH-64, Apache of the Israel Defense Forces with the surgical precision typical of joint operations between military intelligence and the Mossad. But here lies the mystery that few understand. Why did Israel eliminate the very man who was negotiating peace? The answer isn't simple. And that's precisely why you need to know this story. Abu Shab wasn't just another name on Israel's hit list. He was the engineer turned politician, the founder of Hamas who spoke fluent English and championed diplomacy in the midst of the Second Intifada. While Ahmed Yassin mobilized the masses in Gaza, Shab represented the Palestinian Islamist movement on Western television channels, articulating a two-state vision that disturbed radicals and hardliners alike. And if you enjoy this kind of story based on real events full of espionage, covert operations, and mysteries, leave the city you're listening from in the comments and like this video so it reaches more people. Your interaction will greatly help the channel grow. Abu Shab's targeted killing wasn't just Israeli retaliation for suicide bombings. It was a strategic decision that would completely change the course of the Israel-Palestine conflict. This episode reveals layers of intelligence, politics, and warfare that go far beyond what appears in the news. This is not a superficial documentary about the Middle East. Here you will understand the minds behind espionage operations, how a single decision can dismantle years of negotiations, and how the Mossad planned every detail of this mission deep in Palestinian territory. We will delve into the life of a complex man, the tensions between Hamas, Fatah, and the Palestinian Authority under Mahmoud Abbas, and the behind-the-scenes story of Operation Rimmel, which eliminated someone some called a Peacemaker. The August 21st episode was not an isolated act of terrorism or defense. It was the culmination of a calculated strategy involving satellites, informants, pattern analysis, and the final decision to pull the trigger. The question remains, by killing the moderate, did Israel ensure his safety or merely fuel the cycle of violence that persists to this day? To understand this, we must first know who this man, Ismail Abu Shab, was. Who was Ismail Abu Shab? Ismail Abu Shab was born in 1950 in the Nusrat refugee camp, a place where hope always competed with dust and overcrowding. His family had been driven from the village of Alia during the 1948 Nakba, an exodus that forever marked the collective Palestinian memory. Growing up in a refugee camp isn't like growing up in a regular city. It's waking up every day knowing that your home isn't truly yours, that your story has been interrupted, and that return is a promise hanging in the air with no date set for fulfillment. But Chinab was different from most. He had a thirst for knowledge that transcended the barbed wire fences. While many young people around him were becoming radicalized or giving in to despair, he studied, dreamed of engineering, and believed that education would be his most powerful weapon. With a degree in civil engineering from Mansoura University in Egypt, Shahnab didn't stop there. He crossed the Atlantic and earned a master's degree from Colorado State University in the United States. A rarity for a Palestinian from Gaza at the time. Imagine the scene. A Palestinian refugee studying in the heart of the United States during the 1970s, at a time when the Israel-Palestine conflict was already dividing opinions globally. He returned to Gaza bilingual, articulate, and with a worldview few in the region possessed. He became a professor at the Islamic University of Gaza, where his intelligence and charisma attracted students and colleagues. But it was during the 1980s that Shab became close to figures like Ahmed Yassin, Ibrahim Magadmi, and Fadi Shikaki, men who were planting the seeds of what would become Hamas, a movement that would combine Islamic resistance with political action. Shahnab quickly became the organization's number 2, but not in the way you might think. He wasn't the guy behind the suicide bombings or the armed operations. He was the political wing, the moderate, the one who openly advocated for the two-state solution and criticized indiscriminate violence. Married with 9 children, he balanced his family life with secret meetings, tense negotiations, and international media appearances. While Yassin mobilized Gaza with fiery speeches, Shab was the one talking to journalists from the BBC and CNN, explaining the Palestinian struggle in terms the West could understand. He was charismatic, conciliatory, and possessed something rare in Hamas circles, the ability to engage in dialogue without losing his composure. And it was precisely this explosive combination, founding an organization considered terrorist by Israel, yet simultaneously advocating for peace, that put him in the crosshairs of both Palestinian radicals and the Mossad. But to understand why Israel decided to eliminate him, you first need to understand the context in which he operated. Historical context. The 1990s turned the Gaza Strip into a veritable powder keg. After the Oslo Accords, which promised a path to peace between Israel and the Palestinians, Hamas emerged as the main voice of opposition to the Palestinian Authority, led by Mahmoud Abbas and Fatah. While Abbas focused on diplomacy and negotiations, Hamas positioned itself as a symbol of authentic Islamic resistance, one that would not accept concessions or recognize the State of Israel. Gaza lived under a constant blockade with checkpoints, curfews, and a tension that could be felt in the air. In this scenario, Ismail Abu Shab was a unique figure, a man who belonged to Hamas, but saw beyond the rhetoric of jihad, believing that a truce and dialogue could bring concrete results for his people. In 1989, Shab's life changed dramatically when he was arrested by Israel, accused of involvement in the death of an Israeli soldier named Elon Sayan. He spent years in solitary confinement. And if you've read about the Israeli prison system, you know it's no joke. Total isolation, intense interrogations, constant psychological pressure. But Shahnab used this time impressively. He improved his religious studies, read dozens of books on international politics, and solidified his view that armed struggle alone would never liberate Palestine. When he was released in 1996, he didn't return a broken or radicalized man. He returned even more convinced that Hamas needed a political strategy parallel to the resistance. And that's exactly what he began to build. After leaving prison, Shab reorganized Hamas's political wing and became one of the most heard voices in the Arab world. While Ahmed Yassin inspired the Palestinian masses with his sermons in Gaza mosques, Shahnab represented the movement on Western television channels, always articulate and always with solid arguments. He was literally the diplomatic face of an organization the West classified as terrorist. Consider the complexity of this. A man publicly defending the two-state solution while remaining loyal to a movement that officially did not recognize Israel. It was like walking a tightrope over an abyss. And Shab did it with impressive skill. During the Second Intifada, which erupted in 2000 and lasted until 2005, violence reached unprecedented levels. Suicide attacks on Israeli buses, bombings in Gaza, Islamic Jihad operations, retaliations by the Israel Defense Forces. It was an endless cycle of bloodshed and revenge. In this chaotic context, Shahnab emerged as a key figure in the attempts to stem the spiral of violence. He was not alone. He spoke with leaders of Islamic Jihad, the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades, and even Fatah, figures trying to forge something that seemed impossible, a ceasefire that all Palestinian factions would respect. And on June 29, 2003, something extraordinary happened. Shab managed to convince Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and Al-Aqsa to sign a hudna, a formal truce with Israel. But this peace was as fragile as glass within the Israeli government, especially among the hardline wing of the security cabinet. Shahnab was viewed with extreme suspicion. For the Mossad and military commanders, he wasn't a bridge to peace. He was something far more dangerous, a political shield that could legitimize Hamas internationally. Think about it. If Shab could consolidate Hamas as a viable political movement with popular support and international recognition, Israel would lose the narrative that it was only fighting terrorists. Shahnab represented the possibility of Hamas transforming itself of ceasing to be merely an armed group and becoming a legitimate political party like Sinn Féin in Ireland or Yasser Arafat's PLO. And it was precisely this potential for transformation that sealed its death warrant. The question now was no longer if Israel would act, but when and how, and the answer would come sooner than anyone imagined. Preparation of the operation. From the moment the Hudna was signed in June 2003, Israel's eyes never left Ismail Abu Shab. The Mossad, in conjunction with Unit 8200, the Israel Defense Forces Signals Intelligence Division, considered one of the most sophisticated in the world, drastically intensified surveillance of key Hamas leaders in Gaza. Imagine the infrastructure behind it. Satellites, tracking cell phone signals, drones flying silently over neighborhoods, local informants infiltrated in mosques and markets, all functioning as an invisible web that recorded every movement, every call, every encounter. Shahnab didn't know it, but his life had become a real-time spy movie with dozens of analysts in Tel Aviv studying his behavior patterns, mapping his routes, and identifying his vulnerabilities. The truth he fought so hard to build didn't bring peace. It brought a countdown. Behind the scenes in Israeli military intelligence, intense debates raged over Shab's fate. Reports indicate that attempts to capture him alive were seriously considered. After all, arresting a Hamas leader could yield valuable information about the organization's structure, its financiers, and its operational cells. But the operational reality was brutal. Entering Gaza, capturing a high-profile target, and exiting without casualties was a high-risk, almost suicidal mission. The Gaza Strip is not open territory. It is a dense urban labyrinth, where every corner could hide an ambush, where the local population acts as an early warning system for any Israeli presence. So the military command opted for what had worked in previous missions, targeted elimination, the same model used to eliminate Salah Shieta in 2002 and which would be used again against Ahmed Yassin months later. It was faster, cleaner, safer for Israeli operators and irreversible. For days that felt like weeks, the espionage machine worked tirelessly. Drones equipped with high-resolution cameras discreetly flew over the areas where Shab circulated, recording every detail. Local informants, Palestinians, recruited by the Mossad, often under blackmail or for financial rewards, monitored his daily commutes and reported in real time. Shab's routine was ironically his greatest weakness. He was predictable. Every morning he left home, visited colleagues at the Islamic University, attended meetings with local leaders, and spent time with his family. He had no robust security detail, did not constantly change routes, and did not hide. He believed the truce he had negotiated protected him, that his moderate profile made him less vulnerable. But this trust was precisely what Israel hoped to exploit. On the morning of August 21, 2003, all the elements aligned. Intelligence confirmed Shanab's exact location. The weather was favorable for air operations, and final political authorization was given by the highest echelons of the Israeli government. An AH-64 Apache helicopter, that war machine straight out of an action movie, armed with Hellfire missiles capable of piercing heavy armor and blowing up vehicles with surgical precision, was discreetly scrambled toward the Gaza region. The pilots received the coordinates, the target, photos, the full briefing. There would be no room for error, no hesitation. The Mossad provided real-time visual confirmation, and all that remained was to bide their time. Shab was on his way home, driving through the streets of Rimal, completely unaware that this would be his final journey. And then at 4:30 p.m., the Gaza sky transformed into an execution scene, the central event. At 4:30 p.m. on August 21, 2003, Ismail Abu Shanab was in a white sedan, crossing a quiet street in the real neighborhood of Gaza. Beside him were two bodyguards, likely chatting about everyday matters, perhaps about their families, perhaps about the truce they seemed to be holding. Traffic was normal. People were walking along the sidewalks. Merchants were closing their shops in the late afternoon. It was one of those moments that seemed utterly ordinary, where nothing indicates that something extraordinary is about to happen. But in the sky, invisible to the eyes of those on the street, an AH-64 Apache had already locked onto the target. The pilot awaited final confirmation, his fingers poised on the controls, the Hellfire missiles armed. And aimed. And then came the order. Engage target. Fire authorized. Suddenly, the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors filled the air like a mechanical thunderclap, heralding a storm. People in the streets looked up. Some instinctively started running. In Gaza, that sound never meant anything good. 3 missiles were fired in rapid succession, streaking across the sky in a perfect trajectory, guided by cutting-edge technology that made error nearly impossible. The first missile struck the sedan squarely, the impact so violent that the car literally leaped off the ground before disintegrating in a ball of orange fire. The second and third missiles ensured that nothing remained, that there were no survivors, that the mission was completed with the brutal efficiency that characterizes joint Mossad IDF operations. The explosion echoed throughout the neighborhood. Windows rattled car. Alarms blared, and within seconds, what had been a vehicle with 3 men inside was transformed into smoking wreckage scattered across the street. The scene that followed was pure chaos. People ran toward the wreckage, some screaming, others trying to help, even though they knew it was futile. The bodies of Ismail Abu Shab and his 2 bodyguards were charred beyond recognition, fused to the twisted metal of what had once been a car. Ambulances arrived minutes later, but there was nothing to do but collect the remains and transport them to the hospital. The operational signature of the mission was unmistakable. Use of Hellfire missiles guided with surgical precision. An attack on public roads without concern for witnesses. A swift and definitive execution. This was the classic model of targeted killing operations that Israel had been perfecting since the beginning of the Second Inif. Eliminate the target with maximum efficiency. Send a clear message, and leave before any response was possible. While smoke was still rising from the wreckage in Rimmel, Mossad operators in Tel Aviv were already receiving confirmation. Target eliminated. Mission accomplished. But did that few-second explosion actually solve anything? Or did it just light an even bigger fuse? Immediate reactions. News of Ismail Abu Shab's death spread through Gaza like wildfire. Within hours, the entire city knew that the man who had brokered the truce, the moderate, the intellectual, had been eliminated in an Israeli air strike. The reaction was immediate and visceral, a mixture of shock, anger, and profound sadness that filled the streets. The day after the assassination, more than 100,000 people attended Shab's funeral, a display of collective grief that paralyzed Gaza. Among those present were figures such as Ahmed Yassin, the spiritual leader of Hamas, who would be eliminated months later in the same manner, Ismail Haniyeh, who would become one of the organization's most important leaders, and Mahmoud al-Zahar, known for his hardline stance. The crowd carried the body draped in Palestinian and Hamas flags, chanting revenge, vowing that Shab's death would not go unpunished. There at that funeral, you could sense that something had irreversibly changed. The fragile hope of the Hudna had been buried along with its architect. The Palestinian Authority, led by Mahmoud Abbas, issued an immediate condemnation, calling the attack a political assassination that destroyed any chance of reviving the peace process. Abbas was in an impossible position. He was trying to be the legitimate interlocutor between Palestinians and Israelis. But how could he convince his people that diplomacy worked when Israel eliminated the very man who advocated dialogue? On the other side, the Israeli government showed no remorse. Official spokespeople declared that Shab was a senior terrorist responsible for attacks against Israeli civilians and that the operation was part of Israel's self-defense against terrorism. They argued that the truce was merely a Hamas tactic to regroup and that Shanab, despite his moderate rhetoric, still led an organization that promoted violence. The Israeli narrative was clear. No matter how Shanab talked about peace, he was still Hamas and Hamas was the enemy. Internationally, the episode dramatically divided opinion. Some Western analysts and governments saw the attack as an understandable response to the suicide bombing that had occurred in Jerusalem days earlier, killing Israeli civilians on a bus. For them, Israel was exercising its right to defend itself against terrorism. And Shanab, however, moderate he appeared, was still part of Hamas's infrastructure. But others, especially in Europe, the Arab world, and human rights organizations saw the Assassination as the deliberate destruction of a historic opportunity for peace. How can you negotiate if you kill the negotiator? How can you call for moderation if you eliminate the moderates? This criticism resonated strongly in European capitals where diplomats argued that Israel had thrown away its best chance to transform Hamas from an armed movement into a political party. And while the world debated the morality and strategy behind the operation in Gaza, the response was being prepared, and it would come swiftly, violently, and definitively. Disputed versions. On the Israeli side, the official narrative has always been crystal clear. The assassination of Ismail Abu Shab was part of a legitimate policy of self-defense against terrorism. Israeli analysts and officials argued that the Hudna signed in June 2003 was nothing more than a tactical maneuver by Hamas to buy time, reorganize its forces, and prepare new attacks. For them, Shannab was not the pacifist the Western media portrayed him to be. He was a strategic leader of a terrorist organization with the blood of Israeli civilians on his hands. Intelligence documents allegedly linked Shab to Hamas operational cells. Even though he was not directly involved in suicide attacks, the logic was simple and brutal. While Shannab spoke of peace on television, other Hamas members were planning attacks, and he was part of this structure. Therefore, eliminating him was not only legitimate, it was necessary. Israel maintained that it was at war, and in war you don't negotiate. With those who want to destroy you, you act first. But this version met fierce resistance from critics of the operation, both internationally and within Israel itself. Human rights activists, organizations like Amnesty International, and even some former Israeli intelligence officers sharply questioned the decision to eliminate Shannab. The central argument was devastating. The assassination violated international humanitarian law and sabotaged the only ceasefire in effect in the region. Shannab was not planning an imminent attack. He was not holding a bomb. He did not pose an immediate threat. He was literally returning home from political meetings. Some Israeli officials, in off-their-ord conversations, years later admitted the obvious. Shab was not an immediate threat, but they quickly added his political influence strengthened Hamas, and that was dangerous in the long run. In other words, they killed the man not for what he was doing at that moment, but for what he could do in the future to transform Hamas into a legitimate and internationally acceptable political force. The Arab and European media embraced a completely different narrative, portraying the event as the cowardly elimination of a moderate, perhaps the only man within Hamas who truly believed peace was possible. Newspapers like The Guardian, Al Jazeera, and Lemon published extensive analyses, describing Shannab as a bridge between two worlds, someone who could speak the language of both Gaza and Washington. He was the man who could have led Hamas down a political path similar to that which Sinn Féin had taken in Northern Ireland, or that which Yasser Arafat's own PLO had attempted decades earlier. For these analysts, the Mossad and the Israeli government had not killed a terrorist. They had killed the possibility of change, buried Hamas's only real chance for transformation. And the question that lingered, the one no one could answer with certainty, was disturbing. Did Israel truly want peace, or would it prefer to maintain Hamas as an eternal enemy that justified its security policies? This question had no easy answer, but the practical result of the operation would soon become clear, and it would be devastating. Strategic impact. The impact of Ismail Abu Shab's assassination was immediate and brutal. Just 2 days later, on August 23, 2003, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades officially announced the end of the hard-won Hudna. The truce Shab had built with diplomacy, patience, and endless hours of talks with rival factions simply crumbled. And what followed was exactly what anyone with even a passing knowledge of the Middle East could have predicted. A wave of suicide bombings that turned Israeli buses, cafes, and markets into scenes of horror. The Isidin al-Qassam Brigades, Hamas's armed wing, intensified its operations and Islamic Jihad followed suit. Israeli retaliation came in the form of aerial bombardments, ground raids, and more targeted killings. The cycle of violence Shab had sought to break not only continued, it intensified exponentially. Gaza and Israel were plunged back into the hell of the Second Intifada. And the dream of peace was buried under the rubble. But the impact went beyond the explosions and the bodies. Shanab's death drastically weakened the position of Mahmoud Abbas, who at the time was trying to establish himself as the Palestinian leader capable of negotiating a peaceful transition. Abbas had placed all his bets on diplomacy, on security coordination with Israel, on the idea that a two-state agreement could be reached through dialogue. But how could he convince the Palestinians that this path worked if Israel eliminated the very man who represented Hamas's moderate wing? Abbas's credibility crumbled in the eyes of many Palestinians who began to see him as weak, as someone who negotiated while Israel acted. At the same time, Hamas's popularity soared. The organization was no longer seen simply as an armed resistance movement. It became a symbol of Palestinian dignity, of a people who would not bow down, who would return fire with fire. Shanab, who in life advocated moderation, became in death a martyr who championed the exact opposite of what he preached. Externally, the operation generated severe criticism from European countries, the UN, and humanitarian organizations who accused Israel of violating international law and carrying out extrajudicial killings. France, Germany, and the United Kingdom all expressed concern about the escalation of violence and Israel's policy of targeted killings. But these criticisms, however vocalized in international forums, never translated into real consequences. Israel continued its preventive war, arguing that it was protecting its citizens against imminent terrorist threats. The United States, Israel's main ally, maintained discreet but firm support, recognizing Israel's right to self-defense. And while diplomats debated in Geneva and New York, in Gaza and Tel Aviv, the reality was much starker. Each missile begot another missile. Each attack spawned another operation. Each death fueled the next. In the long term, Ismail Abu Shanab's absence marked the definitive end of the diplomatic movement within Hamas. With him dead, there was no one left to publicly articulate the possibility of negotiations with Israel. No one to openly advocate for the two-state solution. No one to speak to Western journalists and explain that Hamas was not a monolith of fanatics. The political space he occupied was filled by more radical leaders, by figures who believed only in armed resistance in the total liberation of Palestine from the river to the sea without concessions. Hamas's transformation from a mixed movement, political and military, to an increasingly militarized organization accelerated after 2003. And perhaps most ironically of all, by killing Shanab to neutralize a threat, Israel eliminated the very man who could have moderated Hamas from within. It was a strategic gamble. And 2 decades later, looking at Gaza and the conflict that never ended, one wonders whether it was a gamble that truly paid off. Legacy and controversies. Ismail Abu Shab is remembered by many Palestinians as a man of peace within war, one of those rare figures who can see beyond the immediate hatred and imagine a different future. On the streets of Gaza, his name is still spoken with respect, especially among those who lived through the Second Inif and saw firsthand the difference between leaders who preached total destruction and those who, like Shab, believed it was possible to coexist. He became a symbol of interrupted moderation, of the path not taken, of the possibility that was blown up along with that white sedan in Remel. Memorials in his honor still appear in Gaza. Palestinian universities debate his legacy and young students study him as an example of an intellectual who did not abandon his cause, but tried to find a diplomatic way out. For those who defend Palestinian resistance without necessarily advocating indiscriminate violence, Shanab represents what could have been a political negotiating Hamas embedded in the international system. For Israel, the story is told radically differently. Within Mossad briefing rooms, in military intelligence reports, and in official speeches, Shab continues to be framed as an example of successful strategic elimination. The Israeli narrative neither romanticizes him as a martyr nor recognizes him as a genuine moderate. He is seen as a clever Hamas operative who used the façade of diplomacy to strengthen a terrorist organization. Israeli officials argue that the operation that killed him prevented Hamas from gaining international legitimacy, from transforming into something like Hezbollah in Lebanon, a consolidated political and military force impossible to ignore or eliminate. In this view, killing Shahnab was a prevention of a bigger problem in the future. It was cutting off the head of the snake before it grew too large. And while some Israeli analysts privately admit that the elimination may have been premature, publicly the official line has never changed. It was a necessary operation, executed with precision that protected Israeli lives. But for opponents of this operation, and they are many both within Israel and internationally, Shab's assassination represents a monumental historical error, the loss of a liaison who could have definitively changed the course of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Imagine if Shahnab had survived. He could have consolidated the 2003 Hudna, extended the ceasefire to years, used his credibility to push Hamas toward implicit recognition of Israel, and paved the way for real negotiations on two states. Historians and Middle East experts have debated this what-if for 2 decades. Some argue that Shab was key to transforming Hamas. Others say he would never have been able to control the radical factions within the organization. What no one can deny is that his death closed a door that has never been reopened. The fine line between justice, revenge, and national security remains at the heart of this episode, and the answer to which side was right likely depends on whether you're sitting in Tel Aviv or Gaza in the Mossad operations room or in a bombed-out house. Closure. The attack that killed Ismail Abu Shab on August 21, 2003 irreversibly altered the course of the Second Intifada and in a sense sealed Gaza's fate for decades to come. Those 3 Hellfire missiles, fired from an Israeli Apache, did more than destroy a car and killed 3 men. They blew up the last real bridge between moderation and radicalism within Hamas, between diplomacy and all-out war. The question that remains is inevitable. What truly changed after that operation? The answer is at once simple and devastating. Perhaps only the continuous cycle of action and retaliation has intensified, a pattern that 20 years later still shapes every decision, every attack, every bombing in Gaza and Israel. The bloodshed that day brought no security to either side. It only fueled the engine of violence that continues to churn. Ismail Abu Shab sought to bridge 2 irreconcilable worlds, Hamas and Israel, armed resistance and political negotiation, jihad and peace. He believed it was possible to belong to an Islamic resistance movement without necessarily condemning his people to eternal war. That it was possible to defend Palestinian rights without turning buses into massacres. And it was precisely this belief that made him too dangerous for some and too valuable for others. In the end, he paid with his life for attempting to occupy this impossible space, for believing that moderation had a place in a conflict where both sides were and still are convinced that only force solves problems. His death was not just the end of a man. It was the symbolic burial of the idea that Hamas could evolve, that peace could be built from within. And here we are more than 2 decades later looking at Gaza and Israel still trapped in the same cycle. Operation Remel, which killed Shab, is just one of hundreds of operations, one explosion among thousands, one name among so many others, eliminated over the years. Ahmed Yassin was killed in 2004, as was Abdulaziz al-Randi shortly after. The list of targeted killings on both sides is too long to fit into any video. But Shahnab's case remains unique because it represents not just the elimination of an enemy, but the deliberate choice to kill the possibility of change. And this choice has consequences. Consequences that still reverberate in every rocket fired from Gaza, in every Israeli military operation, in every generation of Palestinians and Israelis who grow up knowing only war. Ismail Abu Shab's legacy lies not in the streets that bear his name in Gaza, but in the question his death forces us to ask. What happens when you eliminate the moderates and leave only the radicals to negotiate peace? So after learning about Ismail Abu Shab's entire story, understanding how Mossad's espionage operations work, delving behind the scenes of the Second Intifada, and seeing how a single decision can change the fate of millions of people, I ask you, what do you do with this knowledge now? Because there's no point in watching this entire video. Understanding the complexity of the Israel-Palestine conflict, understanding how military intelligence works, and simply continuing to believe the shallow narratives you see out there. Shahnab's story teaches us something fundamental. The world isn't black and white. Moderates exist even within extremist organizations. And sometimes killing the right enemy can create bigger problems than it solves. So I challenge you next time you see news about Gaza, Israel, Hamas, or Mossad, stop and think. Who is being eliminated? Is it an unyielding radical or someone who could make a difference? This ability for critical analysis, for seeing layers beyond the obvious, is what separates those who merely consume information from those who truly understand the world. And here's the real challenge. Are you willing to apply this level of critical thinking to other areas of your life? Because if you've managed to keep up with all the complexity of the Middle East, its espionage, operations, diplomacy, and war, you have the capacity to understand anything: economics, politics, business strategy, international relations. The question is, will you use this capacity, or will you remain superficial, accepting prepackaged and simplistic explanations? Shahnab paid with her life for trying to build bridges. You don't have to pay that price, but you do need to have the courage to question narratives, to seek both sides of the story, to understand that the truth rarely lies in extremes. So, answer me here in the comments. After learning this story, what other secret operation, what other historical conflict, what other controversial figure do you want us to unravel here on the channel? What other secrets of the Mossad, the CIA, and MI6 do you want to uncover? And if you've made it this far, if you've truly absorbed everything that's been said about Ismail Abu Shab, about how a targeted elimination can have consequences that last decades, then you deserve to continue having access to this kind of profound content. So, subscribe to the channel now and turn on the notification bell, because every week there's a new video unraveling real stories of espionage, geopolitical conflicts, and covert operations that change the world. Don't let this knowledge die here. Share it with someone who also likes to truly understand the world, who isn't satisfied with superficial headlines. And tell me, do you think Israel made the right choice in eliminating Shahnab? Or was it a historic strategic error? The answer isn't obvious, and that's precisely why it's worth debating. I'll see you in the comments and in the next video.